The Sea of Galilee looks gentle in the daylight. Fishermen cast their nets. Children run along the shore. Boats drift slowly across the water. But when night comes, the sea reveals another nature. Cold winds descend suddenly from the surrounding hills. Warm air rises from the surface of the water. Without warning, calm turns into chaos. Storms are born here quickly, violently, silently. This is not myth. It is geography. And it is here, on this unpredictable sea, that one of the most unsettling moments in the Gospels takes place. It begins quietly. Jesus had been teaching all day. Crowds pressed in from every direction. Questions, needs, desperation. As evening approached, he did something unexpected. He said, "Let us go across to the other side." There was no explanation, no promise of safety, just movement. They entered the boat as daylight faded. The shoreline slowly disappeared behind them. Darkness closed in. The disciples were experienced sailors. Several of them had grown up on these waters. They knew its patterns. They knew its dangers. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Then, Jesus lay down, and he fell asleep. This single detail has disturbed readers for centuries. How could he sleep? Knowing what these waters could become, how could he rest, while leading others into the unknown? The answer is not found in the storm. It is found in who he believed himself to be. The wind began to rise. At first it was subtle, a shift in the air, a tension that seasoned fishermen recognize instinctively. Then the waves grew taller, stronger, relentless. Water crashed into the boat. The vessel began to fill. The night erased the horizon. Up and down became meaningless. Only survival mattered. Panic spread quickly. This was no ordinary storm. The disciples worked desperately, bailing water, shouting over the wind, fighting against forces far stronger than themselves, and Jesus slept. The sound of the storm surrounded him. The rocking of the boat did not wake him. Fear did not wake him, because fear was not his master. Eventually, desperation overcame restraint. They shook him awake. And the words they spoke were not polite. They were not, "Come, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" This was more than a question. It was an accusation. In that moment, the storm outside the boat had already entered their hearts. Jesus stood. There was no rush, no visible alarm. He faced the chaos, and he spoke, not to the disciples, not to the boat, to the storm itself. "Peace, be still." The words were simple. The effect was absolute. The wind stopped. The waves collapsed into silence. Water that moment before threatened death now lay smooth, like glass. The sea obeyed, but something unexpected happened next. Relief did not come. Instead, fear deepened. A heavier silence filled the boat. Jesus turned toward them, and he asked a question that cut deeper than the storm ever had. "Why are you so afraid?" Then another, "Where is your faith?" These were not words of anger. They were words of revelation. Because the greatest danger that night was never the water. It was the misunderstanding of who stood among them. The disciples looked at one another. And the question formed, unspoken, but unmistakable. Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? This is where the miracle truly begins, not with power, but with identity. The most unsettling detail of this story is not the storm. It is the sleep. Jesus did not close his eyes because he was unaware. He slept because he was unafraid. To understand this moment, we must understand the weight of sleep in danger. Sleep is the ultimate sign of trust. No one sleeps when they believe control is slipping away. The disciples fought the storm because they believed survival depended on them. Jesus slept because he knew it did not. This was not exhaustion alone. It was confidence, not confidence in circumstances, but confidence in identity. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus often withdraws when pressure increases. He leaves crowds. He escapes praise. He seeks solitude. Rest, for him, is not weakness. It is alignment. The disciples, however, saw sleep as indifference. Do you not care? They asked. This question reveals more about them than about him. Fear always assumes abandonment. When control disappears, the human heart quickly asks, "Have I been left alone?" But silence does not mean absence, and rest does not mean neglect. Jesus stood when awakened, but not because he had just become aware of the danger. He stood because the lesson had reached its moment. The storm was not accidental. It was instructional. Throughout Scripture, water represents chaos. From the opening lines of Genesis, the Spirit hovers over restless waters. In ancient thought, The sea is not peaceful. It is untamed, unpredictable, hostile. Only God commands it. Psalm 89 declares, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." Job is asked, "Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb?" These were not metaphors. They were declarations of authority. When Jesus speaks to the storm, he does not pray. He does not call on heaven. He commands, "Peace, be still." The language is sharp, corrective. The same words used to silence disorder. In that moment, the disciples are not witnessing a miracle, they are witnessing a claim. Nature responds immediately, chaos recognizes authority. But here is the most revealing detail. Jesus does not celebrate, he does not turn to the disciples and say, "Look what I can do." Instead, he questions them, "Why are you afraid?" This question reframes the entire event. The storm was not the test, fear was. Faith is not the belief that storms will not come. Faith is the trust that presence remains. When they do, the disciples believed Jesus could teach, they believed he could heal, but authority over nature forces a deeper question. If the sea obeys him, then who is he? Their fear after the miracle is greater than before it, because power is comforting only when it is familiar. And this power was not. The calm sea revealed something terrifying. They were not merely traveling with a teacher, they were in the presence of someone far greater. This is why Jesus slept. Because he was not threatened. And because he wanted them to confront the limits of their own control. Faith grows not when storms are avoided, but when control is surrendered. The storm stopped instantly, but the lesson did not. It had only begun. The storm ended instantly, not gradually, not reluctantly. One moment, chaos. The next, silence. The sea that moments earlier threatened death now lay flat beneath the moonlight. The boat stopped rocking. The wind no longer screamed. Everything became still, and yet no one spoke. This is the detail most often missed. The miracle solved the external danger, but it created an internal one. Fear did not leave the boat. It changed direction. Before, fear came from the water. Now, it came from understanding. The disciples did not cheer. They did not embrace one another in relief. Instead, they stared at the sea, at the silence, at him. Scripture tells us they were filled with great fear, not small fear, not ordinary fear, a deep, reverent terror, because this kind of fear is not born from threat, it is born from proximity. When danger comes from outside, humans fight or flee, but when power stands beside you, unexplained and undeniable, there is nowhere to run. The question formed quietly among them, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? This was not curiosity. It was realization. Every Jewish child grew up with stories of the sea, the Red Sea parting before Moses, the Jordan stopping for Joshua, the Psalms declaring God's mastery over waves. The sea was never neutral. It represented forces only God controlled. And now, those forces had responded to a man standing in their boat. This was not a prophet calling on heaven. This was not a prayer being answered. This was command. Authority. And authority changes relationships. They had followed him as a teacher. They had listened as students. They had watched as witnesses, but now they were confronted with something else. Holiness. Holiness is not comforting at first. It exposes. It removes illusion. It forces a question no one can avoid forever. If this power is real, then what does it demand? The disciples' fear after the miracle reveals the true purpose of the storm. The storm was never meant to drown them. It was meant to show them who was already with them. Jesus did not explain himself. He did not give a lecture. He allowed silence to teach, because some truths cannot be argued into the heart. They must be encountered. The calm sea became a mirror, and in that reflection, the disciples saw their assumptions collapse. They had believed faith meant safety, but faith, they learned, meant trust. Not in outcomes, but in presence. Jesus did not promise smooth seas. He revealed sovereign companionship. The boat continued its journey, but nothing was the same. They would remember this night, when storms came again, and they would come again, but now they carried a new understanding. Fear does not disappear when power is revealed. It is transformed into or is the beginning of wisdom. The question the disciples asked that night was not new. Who then is this? It echoed questions that had been asked for centuries. In the Hebrew Scriptures, authority over nature belongs to one alone. God. The sea, in particular, is never treated casually. In ancient Israel, the sea was chaos personified, unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous. It was not something humans mastered. It was something God restrained. In the book of Job, God speaks of the sea as a wild force, who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, and said, "Thus far shall you come, and no farther." The sea has limits, not because it chooses them, but because they are imposed. In the Psalms, God is praised as the one who still the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves. These are not poetic exaggerations, they are theological boundaries. The sea obeys God because it recognizes its creator. This is why the moment on the boat is so unsettling. Jesus does not invoke God's name, he does not appeal upward, he does not perform a ritual, he speaks directly, and the sea responds. For a Jewish audience, this is impossible to ignore. If the sea listens to him, then he is operating within divine authority. Not borrowed authority, not delegated power, but inherent command. This is why Jesus' question, "Where is your faith?" cuts so deeply. He is not asking whether they believed he could stop the storm, he is asking whether they understood who he was. Faith, in this context, is not optimism. It is recognition. Throughout the Old Testament, God reveals himself not only through words, but through mastery over creation. The plagues of Egypt, the parting of waters, fire from heaven. Creation responds when God speaks. Now, on the Sea of Galilee, creation responds again, but the voice is human. Or so it appears. This moment quietly redefines identity. Jesus is not merely acting with God, he is acting as God, not in opposition to the Father, but in unity. This is not theology explained. It is theology demonstrated. And demonstration is harder to dismiss. The disciples did not yet have language for what they had witnessed, but something irreversible had occurred. Their categories were broken. Teacher, rabbi, healer, none of these were sufficient anymore, because none of them explain why chaos listens. This authority over creation will appear again in the Gospels. Fig trees wither at his command, water becomes wine, bread multiplies in his hands. Nature does not resist him. It cooperates. Because creation recognizes its source. The storm was not an isolated event. It was a revelation, a quiet declaration spoken not to crowds, but to those closest to him. You are not merely following wisdom, you are standing in the presence of authority. The sea knew it. And now, so did they. The storm did not arrive by accident. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story. Jesus chose to cross the sea. He chose the timing, he chose the night, and he chose to sleep, which means the storm was not a disruption. It was part of the journey. Formation rarely happens in comfort. It happens when assumptions are stripped away. The disciples believed faith meant protection, safety, predictability, but faith, as Jesus reveals it, is something deeper. Faith is not control, it is surrender. The storm exposed what they trusted. Their experience, their strength, their understanding. All of it failed, and when it did, fear surfaced. Fear is not the enemy of faith, it is the place where faith is tested. Jesus did not calm the storm immediately because immediate rescue would have taught nothing. The struggle was necessary. They needed to reach the end of themselves. Only then could they recognize who was truly in control. Throughout Scripture, God forms his people through crisis. Abraham waits in uncertainty. Israel wanders in the wilderness. Elijah hears God not in wind or fire, but in silence. Fear becomes the environment where trust is born. The disciples' panic was not shameful. It was revealing. It showed them how little they truly understood, and understanding is not given until the heart is ready to receive it. Jesus allowed the storm to rise because revelation requires contrast. Peace has no meaning without chaos. Authority is invisible until it is challenged. When Jesus stood and spoke, he was not reacting. He was revealing. The storm served its purpose. It showed the disciples their limits, and it showed them his absence was never real. He was there the entire time. Sleeping. Unthatened. Present. The question, do you not care, was answered not with explanation, but with action. Care was never absent. Fear had simply blinded them to it. This is why storms remain part of the Christian story. Not because God delights in fear, but because trust cannot grow without something to trust him through. The disciples left the storm with fewer illusions and deeper faith. And that was the point. When the storm ended, nothing looked the same. The sea was calm, but the disciples were not. Silence filled the boat. Heavier than the wind had been, fear had changed its shape. Before, they feared the storm. Now, they feared the one who spoke to it. This was not terror. It was awe, a realization settling slowly into their hearts. They were not merely traveling with a teacher. They were in the presence of authority that did not belong to this world. Faith did not arrive as confidence. It arrived as humility. They asked a question that has echoed through centuries. Who is this? Not how did he do this? Not why us? But who? Identity had become the central mystery. The storm stripped away familiarity. Jesus was no longer only the man who ate with them, walked with them, laughed with them. He was something more, something unsettling. True faith often begins where comfort ends. The disciples did not immediately understand what they had witnessed. Understanding takes time, transformation begins with tension. They would remember this night when future storms came, not just storms of water, but storms of doubt, persecution, and loss. This moment became a reference point. When fear returned, they could look back and say, we have seen his authority. Faith is built from memory. From moments where fear did not win. The disciples were being prepared for a future without constant reassurance, a future where Jesus would not always be visible. This storm was training. Not to eliminate fear, but to place it in the right context. Fear loses its power when it encounters something greater. Their faith was no longer theoretical. It was personal, rooted in experience. They had seen chaos obey a voice, and that voice knew their names. Faith matured quietly that night. No applause, no celebration. Only reflection. The calm sea mirrored an inner shift. They would still struggle. They would still doubt. But something irreversible had happened. They had crossed a threshold from followers of a teacher to witnesses of divine authority. And once that line is crossed, there is no return to innocence. The storm was over, but the journey of faith had only just begun. The storm passed. The sea returned to stillness. But storms did not end that night. They never do, because the story was never about water. It was about presence. The disciples would face many storms after this one, some louder, some darker, some without waves at all. They would face rejection, fear, loss. They would stand in crowds that turned hostile. They would run when courage failed them. They would watch their teacher suffer and die. And in those moments, the memory of the storm would return, not as fear, but as grounding. They had seen chaos submit. They had heard authority speak, and that memory became a quiet anchor. Storms did not disappear from their lives, but their meaning changed. Storms were no longer proof of abandonment. They became reminders of presence. The question Jesus asked that night still echoes today. Why are you afraid? Not as accusation. As invitation. Fear assumes absence. Faith remembers presence. Jesus did not promise calm seas. He revealed a greater truth, that he remains, even when the storm does not leave. The silence after the storm was not emptiness. It was awareness, a realization that God does not always rescue us from the storm, but often reveals himself within it. And this is where the story turns toward us. Our storms may look different. They may not involve waves or wind. They may live inside the mind, the heart, the unseen places. But the question remains the same. Who do you believe is with you when fear rises? The disciples did not receive answers that night. They received something deeper, a memory. A presence, a truth that could be carried into future darkness. The storm ended, but faith began, and that is why this story still matters, because storms still come. But presence remains.